Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. I'm your host, Karissa Parks, and I've got my fantastic teammate here, Holly Tate. As we get started, we would love to hear where you're from. Holly, you're in Houston. What is the weather like here in Houston?
Well, it's kind of a miracle today because normally you're in Orlando. Normally we have very similar weather, but this morning I walked outside and it was like, I feel like fall is actually on its way. So I think it is still supposed to be like a high of 92, but this morning it was in the high 70s and I took a moment to just be very grateful for it.
So grateful for that fall weather that is coming. We only have one season here. And so
Yeah,
if you're in Orlando like me, it is hot, it is rainy, it is gross, and the bugs are still plentiful. So shoot us over in the chat. Make sure that you toggle over to make sure you're responding to everybody so everyone can say hello and hear where you're from.
Yeah, totally. We've already got, looks like over 30 folks that have already logged on today. So can't wait to hear where you're joining from. Chattanooga, that's fun. My brother, sister-in-law, and nephew live in Chattanooga, Tiffany. Joe, hey Joe, good to see you. We love Carolina Industrial Products. Joe, I feel like I need to send you some cookies or something. You are like on every webinar and I love seeing your name on there. That's awesome. We've got Nashville, Fallon. I'm originally from Nashville. That's cool. We've got Phoenix, Houston, Charleston, South Carolina. Karissa and I are both love oysters. So we need to take a visit over to Charleston for sure. In California, man, Brian, you guys are, whoo, it is hot there in California right now. I've been hearing on the news what you guys are facing out there in California, and that is rough. Thinking of y'all for sure. Oh, and then Chrissy, another Leadr customer. So Karissa, Chrissy says she's currently in Colorado. And the reason for that is that her and her family have been living out of an RV. You can actually follow them on Instagram and they post about their adventures. So yeah,
wow,
it's really
that's incredible. I'm excited to start seeing some of the Northeast in here as well as the Midwest, because everywhere else was from here in the Southeast where it's brutally hot. So I know Middletown, New York, in New Jersey, you guys are all enjoying that beautiful fall crisp weather that I am envious of here in Orlando. Well, as we continue to get started, I'd love to see emoji version of how you feel when you hear the word feedback.
Ooh, I like that. So this is a fun Zoom feature where if you guys, where you were just posting in chat about where you're from, there is a little emoji option. So you can click there. I'm actually going to click it right now. Karissa, you can do the same. What emoji do you feel when you feel the word feedback? I love that question, Karissa. Good idea. Let's see. I'm going to look. I'm going to say this one. That's how I feel. Like, yeah.
These are so good. Well, if you're tracking along with us all week, we have posted a few polls and we asked, how do you prefer to receive feedback? In person, delayed, immediate, and even if that needs to be through email or a message, we wanted to hear from you. What is your preference? Before I reveal the results, Holly, how do you best like to receive feedback?
Definitely in person. So I love to I can get in my head about it if it's written first, especially if I don't know the person really well. So to have it in person where I can read their body language and I'm pretty hard on myself. So if I can hear it in person first, that goes much better than getting it written first for sure. What about you?
I prefer it immediate, whichever way. And so I'm usually at pretty high adrenaline most of the time. And so if you give me feedback after I've come down from the adrenaline, it's going to get it back up again. So we might as well just take care of it while we can. And that way I can process in the moment and be able to handle it a little bit better. Brian, you win. That is the best answer I have read. Not quite an emoji, but that was great. The cookies. Everybody had very similar type faces, minus Joe. Joe, do you nerd out when it comes to receiving feedback? We want to learn more. Teach us your ways. Tell everyone in the chat a little bit more about that nerd emoji.
I saw that too. I saw it as like cool, calm, and collected, which is
Ooh.
also impressive. Yeah.
I love that you think that about Joe. I'm sure he does that.
So true. So true.
Awesome. Well, why don't we just go ahead and get started? Holly, you actually have some very strong opinions about feedback. And what you're going to do today and help us walk through is figure out first why feedback has such a bad stigma around it. And because of experiences that you have had, you become very passionate about leading this culture here at Leadr where feedback isn't weird. So why don't you get us started and dive into a little bit more of your story and how this happened for you?
Yes. Well, feedback is really important to me for a couple of reasons. So number one, I've been on the receiving end of feedback that was really poorly given, and I carried it with me for many years out of an experience that I had. And then I've also been on the receiving end of feedback that was really helpful and very well given of how I was not great at giving feedback to my team. So that's my hope for everybody that's joining us today, whether you're an executive leader and you're leading a team, or whether you are a frontline employee or an individual contributor, that we both get more comfortable with feedback, because it's so important that we're both giving and receiving it. So my story, Karissa, is I was in a meeting one day, in a leadership team meeting, and we were having a really like important but kind of got heated discussion. And I'm a very passionate person. That's pretty clear. If you've been on webinars with me in the past, that is pretty clear. And I was, all three of us in this conversation had very strong opinions about the topic that we were discussing. And so I said my part and was, doing my best to get my point across and really trying to explain where I was coming from. And one of the other leaders in the room said, "Holly, you're too animated." And what that stuck with me for years. And so I spent several years after that conversation really believing that I was too animated and really trying to suppress a lot of my personality and opinions and to try to adapt to this person's feedback. But what I learned was that really wasn't helpful feedback. That was actually criticism. So instead, what she was really trying to share with me, she wasn't wrong in the sense that I am animated. I am passionate. I really cared about the topic that we were talking about because it had to do with the organization, that I was working for and moving us forward. And it was really my care that was leading to why I was being so animated. But if she had instead said, "Holly, your opinion is really important to me, and I can tell you really care about this issue, and I'm so glad you do. But the way that you're sharing it right now, I'm not really able to hear you because your animation is getting in the way of me really being able to hear your opinion." And that would have been coaching. That would have been feedback rather than criticism. And so that was a moment for me where I really thought, man, I want to be, as a leader, I want to be different. I want to give effective feedback. And then the other side of that, now, sitting in the executive seat, and this was a few years ago, this was the first time I ever managed somebody. And if you are a Leadr customer and you got Leadr Pulse, our newsletter today, you read this story. But I was leading someone for the first time. We had great rapport. I mean, it was one of those, we were an amazing team, Karissa. Like we complemented each other's strengths. We ran fast together. It was awesome. We worked together for about 5 years. And as it was time for her to transition onto her next role, I did an exit interview and asked her for her feedback of, hey, how can I be a better leader? How could I have supported you better? And she said, "Holly, you're so good at finding all of the things that we can improve. That's what makes you really great at your job. But where you really need to pay attention is celebrating the wins right in front of us, because it can often be exhausting when you're only pointing out the things that can be improved." And that was such helpful feedback for me. It changed the trajectory of how I lead. And that's still my tendency to always lean towards the things that can be better. And so for her to share that with me and give me that feedback, because she really cared about me and my leadership and the future of our team, really meant the world to me. And the way she shared it was just so helpful and tactful, and it stuck with me years later. And now I think about it almost every day.
Yeah, Holly, when I think about when I first became a leader here at Leadr, some of the coaching that you gave me was that feedback should be helping somebody achieve their goals. And so keep their end goals in mind. Exactly like that conversation that happened early on for you. If they would have said, hey, I hear you and I know you want to get to here, but what you're doing right now is not helping you get to here. And
Mhm.
how that has just transformed the way that I give and receive feedback when it comes to that. And a lot of it is because of this next image that we want to share with you in regards to how it should feel when somebody is in healthy conflict, that you're coming alongside them and it's not just you versus me anymore, but it's us versus this problem. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The top image here is the first story that I told, right? Like when I got the feedback that I was too animated, it felt like it was a you versus me. Versus when the person on my team in her exit interview gave me the feedback of how to make sure that I was stopping and celebrating wins. It was more of what we're seeing here at the bottom, where it was, hey, I know you want to lead this team well, and here's some feedback to help you get there. And so the difference here is the top one, which is unhealthy conflict, that's criticism. So I was being criticized for my personality and a part of who I am by being told I was too animated. What's on the bottom is more coaching feedback. And so even though the person reported to me, it was super helpful. She was helping coach me by leading up and giving me that feedback so that I could go on and lead the team even better than before. And so I love this image because I think it's just a really helpful way for us to visualize the difference between criticism and coaching when it comes to feedback.
Absolutely. Well, it's obvious you and I are both very passionate about feedback in this topic. And it's not just because of our personal experiences. It's because when Leadr was in the making and all the research was being done, we found that 5 things need to happen consistently for an employee to feel engaged. Lo and behold, feedback is part of it. It's actually right smack in the middle that an employee gives and receives frequent feedback from their managers. And here at Leadr, we level that up even more because we really encourage peer accountability and helping our peers win as well. So it's not just always getting pushed down from the top, and that we're really helping level up the entire organization by helping each other get better because we all have a goals to achieve personally, professionally, and as a company.
It's so true, Chris. And I feel like when we were initially doing research on how to even build Leadr, there were 2 things we noticed when we were looking across at high performing teams. So number one, feedback is a critical component of high performing teams. Well, what we often see is one of 2 things. Either feedback is non-existent because we're too scared to give it. And so then we have to make a transition conversation or we have to have a performance conversation and it's a surprise. And that's really hurtful when it gets to that point because we've been too scared or we've withheld feedback and haven't given it to our teammates as a part of their growth and development. On the other side, I see the pendulum swing way too far to where it's toxic. So all anyone is ever hearing is constructive or negative feedback, and it's often given in a criticizing way to where people are scared and there's a lot of anxiety around the word feedback because they've only ever heard negative or constructive feedback. And so those are the 2 things that I see are most common. And we want to be a part of making sure that the word healthy is so important, that it's a healthy culture of feedback, because not giving any feedback and giving only toxic feedback, that's where we get unhealthy.
Oh, goodness. Well, as we looked into the chat, we saw lots of probably a little bit more negative / confused emotions when it came through those emojis. Joe in the chat shared that he feels like it's been super helpful for him and that he gets to sit in a role in his organization to drive feedback. And that most people think he is a nerd because he gets super excited about this. Joe, we're right there with you. Holly and I both love feedback. This is a regular part of our rhythms. But for those of you that this is not normal, it is weird to give and receive feedback, you're probably asking yourself, how do I start? So, Holly, how does somebody start when they've never done this before?
Yeah, I mean, the first key is kind of what we just touched on, but really understanding the difference between positive and constructive feedback. So another way to think about this would be strengths. So that would be positive feedback, and then areas of improvement, which would be constructive feedback, which are opportunities for your teammate to learn and grow. And so it's critical that we're structuring our feedback in these two different ways to make sure that we're separating these. So we do this a lot here at Leadr. You know, Karissa, you've gotten many emails from me after we've had that face-to-face conversation, debrief something, and then you'll get an email recap that says, you know, as a recap, here are areas of strength, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then here's some areas of improvement that we'll work on together, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And being able to be really clear about those two different areas is key. Now, similar to my story earlier, which I know you've got some really great stats around this, Karissa, we need to make sure that we are sharing more positive feedback than constructive feedback. Now, this is outside of a performance issue, right? This isn't a normal, healthy cadence and rhythm between a manager and a direct report. We need to make sure that we're calling out those areas of strength and giving that positive feedback on a regular basis. Don't be like how I have been before, where that employee, like in your head, you're like, they're amazing, they're the best. Like, I can't imagine my team without them. But then haven't ever told them those things. And so we need to make sure that we're actually communicating positive feedback as well as constructive feedback.
Absolutely. I actually sent out a feedback request to a few teammates and asked, what are my top 3 strengths in this particular seat? What are my bottom 3 objectives that I probably should pay attention to and work on? And this person knew me so well that not only did they list out the top ones, they said, here are your strengths, and I'm going to list out your top ones again, because I know you just went and skipped to the constructive feedback that I had.
That's really, yeah, I can totally see you doing that. 100%. Yep.
Oh, goodness. Well, Holly, you do this so well with me, and usually it's pretty immediate. And that's what I really love about the statistic here, is how it's so important that high performing teams have a very strong rapport with their leaders, because we both know we earn trust in buckets, but man, it takes just like a drop to go ahead and spill those out. And so for you, you'll often reply to an email that you might be copied on, and you're like, hey, great email. This is fantastic. I know you're trying to communicate this. So next time, maybe say this, or maybe it's a Slack. We've been on Zoom meetings before, and you have Slacked me like, hey, speak up. They want to hear from you. Like, that's really great. And it's always super helpful to hear those positive reinforced moments that like you have something to offer here, and we value that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think to make sure that we're doing it immediately, and this stat is huge. Like, the research says that highest performing teams have a 6-to-1 ratio of positive to negative feedback. So I want us to pay attention to this. Number one, high performing teams. I think everybody on this webinar wants to be a high performing team, or on either lead or be on a high performing team. So how do we do that? I mean, the data tells us it's a 6-to-1 ratio of positive to negative feedback. And so as a leader, I'm constantly asking myself, when's the last time I gave positive feedback? And usually for me, I'll carve out time. Like Friday afternoon is a time, like as I'm closing out the week, I really try to be intentional about individually pinging different people on my team with specific ways that I saw them live out our values that week, or, you know, crush a project that they were working on. Is it really does take intentionality to slow down enough to really make sure that we're giving that positive feedback. And then our CEO and co-founder Karissa says this, and I love this, like, catch someone doing something right. So in those moments, don't just think it like, wow, Karissa did a great job on that thing. Like, actually take the time to put it in writing, whether it's a Slack or a text message or an email, or we pull them aside, you know, in the hallway to really verbalize catching them doing it right, so that that goes such a long way when we're able to communicate that to our team members, especially when positive feedback is in written communication.
Absolutely. In fact, in one of my morning huddles, this is a reoccurring agenda item in Leadr for us, and is catch somebody doing something right. And it is so fun throughout the day to be able to add a comment to that agenda item and watch everybody else's kind of pour in. And then we all get to reflect on it in the morning. And not only did we read it, we knew that was going into a meeting, but then we get to verbalize it to that person. Like, no, I really want to make sure you hear me say, this was so great, and I'm so appreciative you did these things.
That's awesome. That's so cool. And what a great way to use Leadr to do that as a recurring agenda item. That's a great idea.
Absolutely. So we talked about what that looks like from a one-to-one meeting. So how do you do this from a coach perspective versus a manager perspective?
Yeah. So, I mean, kind of back to the image of the, you versus me, and then the us versus the problem. And this is the key difference that when I think of the difference between a manager and a coach. So one of our mantras here at Leadr is that we want to make every manager a coach and give every employee a voice. And that distinction is so important. Coach it. Let's think about, a coach on a field or on a court. Their goal is to help the team win. And they have a very clear playbook and who's going to be in what position at what time in the game, what goals they need to achieve in order to get there. Whereas too often, I think we think of ourselves as managers as we've got a task list to achieve, and it's about getting that done. And anyone or anything that's in my way needs to get out of my way. But the problem is when we think about it that way, and we're not putting our people first and realizing that they're a critical part, like the only way we get the job done is developing our people, bringing them along for the journey, equipping them, developing them to help achieve the mission or get the job done. That's the difference between the perspective of a coach and a manager. Again, it's, hey, this is the goal that we're trying to achieve. Can I share some feedback on how I can help you achieve that goal? Rather than, hey, here's some perceived faults or mistakes that you've made based on who you are. There's a very, it can feel subtle, but it's really, really important that we're making sure when we're giving feedback, we're coaching, which is keeping the goal as the end in mind, and then giving our feedback based on how to achieve that goal, not based on perceived faults or mistakes of the person, which would be more of the criticism and what I think a lot of managers do and what gets us in trouble and erodes trust with our teammates.
Absolutely. And when you're doing this in every single one-on-one, you start to remove those layers of awkwardness and fear even, and get to change the definition, and where feedback becomes no longer a dirty word, especially when it's centered around goals and mission and objectives, like all the other things that you're talking about in your one-on-one. And it's so important because people truly want to know where they stand.
It is, especially the next generation, Karissa. We've talked about this quite a bit. There's this stat that Gen Zers, they will leave the job if they're not getting the opportunity to learn and grow. And I've seen this firsthand. I kind of had a chip on my shoulder coming into my role here at Leadr, because I've done a lot of talks on leading millennials, and I am a millennial. And so, have kind of had a platform around leading the next generation. And so we have a lot of Gen Zers on our team at Leadr. And I was like, oh, I got this. Well, one of the things I realized was they crave feedback, and they crave it immediately. And it makes sense if we think about it. I mean, this is the first generation that has grown up with everything on demand. Millennials, I think we've said that about millennials, but we think about it like, I don't know about you, Karissa, but I'm a millennial, and I remember when we did not have internet at my house. Like Gen Zers don't remember that. And so for them to be able to post a photo on Instagram, they get immediate feedback, they get likes, they get comments. And so they expect that out of their managers and in the workplace, is that immediate feedback. And so it's really critical that we as managers and as leaders really start to build a culture of immediate feedback, both in areas of strength, positive feedback, and constructive feedback, because they want to learn and grow. Otherwise, they'll go find somewhere else to go learn and grow.
Absolutely. So let's start to unpack this a little bit more. How do we move from a manager kind of criticism type feedback to more of a coaching mindset when it comes to feedback?
Yeah, so here's some real practical steps. And so I would encourage you to kind of do a self-audit. Like, where do you tend to fall on this spectrum? Are you more on that coaching side or more on that manager side? And so on the coaching side, we're thinking about the employee's performance rather than commanding tasks and just delegating work. Obviously, that's a huge part of developing our teammates is delegation, but the delegation is because we want our team members to grow and learn and develop and perform at their very best. We want to increase employee engagement, right? I mean, the data tells us that the most engaged employees are having at least weekly check-ins with their managers. And so that means that we're a coach. We're there on a regular basis to check in, help remove obstacles. And so it's more about that perspective of developing and driving engagement of our teams rather than being reactive, putting out fires, just getting through our checklist of things to do. And so this is a key component of thinking about our roles as leaders and as managers as more of coaches rather than just a manager of tasks and projects.
Yeah. Holly, I know personally that this type of feedback helps me know that I am cared for and that you want me here at Leadr and contributing and growing, not just because it helps our company, but because it helps me. Like, you care about me as a person and the hard and the soft skills that I get to learn.
That's awesome. Well, thank you. I'm glad that you're experiencing that. Definitely not perfect at it, but definitely try.
Awesome. So what happens when you have to give negative feedback? How do we handle that?
Yeah, so it should always be a conversation first. And so we heard that a lot through like our emojis at the beginning of our time together today, and even some of the feedback that we've gotten in the chat. It is always best to give constructive feedback verbally first. I've experienced this before. I had a manager in the past who would process information through writing. And so I would get these novel emails from him that was often feedback or thoughts based on a conversation we had had the day before. And what happened was every time I would see his name pop up in my inbox, I would literally have like an anxious reaction. Like, I would start sweating. I would feel a lot of anxiety because all of the emails that I got from him were full of constructive feedback. And it's not that that's wrong. I mean, his job was to help develop me and give me that feedback, but the way that it was delivered was just ineffective. And honestly, it really gave me a lot of anxiety, which caused me to not perform at my very best. And so instead, the best thing to do is to, in our regular one-on-ones, have the conversation of giving constructive feedback, both positive and constructive feedback. When we're doing that on a weekly basis, where we're saying, hey, I was thinking about you and your goal to achieve XYZ, I wanted to share some feedback of something I noticed last week that I think would help you achieve that goal more effectively. Can I share that with you? When we're doing that in our regular one-on-ones, then they expect it from us on a regular basis, and it becomes not weird. Then we follow it up with written feedback. Hey, just wanted to recap our conversation, Karissa. Again, we're thinking about your goal of XYZ. And so when you are doing this, let's do it this way instead. I think it's going to help you achieve your goal much more effectively. So we should always make sure that those constructive feedback conversations should be verbal, and then we recap it in written. Now, positive feedback should always be written. I think it's great to also make sure we're giving it verbally first, but we also really want to make sure we're writing it. It's great for employees to be able to take a screenshot or file it away or capture it so they can go back to it, because we tend to remember the negative or constructive feedback more than the positive feedback. And so when we write it down, they're able to capture that and go back to it on those days where they need a little pep in their step and need to be reminded of what they're doing well and where they're winning.
Absolutely. And because people carry the emotions that with feedback, I love that we have a recap culture here, because that really helps pull the whole thing together. And what we call that here is closing the feedback loop. For somebody like me that can get really caught up in some of the negative pieces or the places that I still have to go, I'm always focusing on the gap that I have instead of the gains that I've made. And so this really helps me, like, okay, we're done here. Let's move on and let's do things differently moving forward. I love that we do this here.
Yeah, it's so true. When I first came on board to Leadr and heard about, hey, can you send me a recap of that? I was like, what is a recap? That sounds scary. But the reality is what we're doing by sending recaps, which we will unpack more in a second, is we're just really building a culture of making sure that what I said is what you heard. Because if we're, especially if we're giving a presentation or we're having a group meeting or even in a one-on-one setting, what we think we said or what we thought we were clear on, the person might have heard it in a different way. And so being able to send a recap that just that helps make sure we're on the same page. Karissa, Brian put a question in the Q&A that aligns really well with that conversation around should feedback be in person or private. And so Brian, I hope that helped answer your question. But again, I think that it's always helpful to have that conversation verbally first and then follow up with written. So here's what I do, Karissa, just like really practical. And I know Brian is a Leadr customer. So especially for our Leadr customers who are listening, what I'll do is I will put the feedback as a hidden agenda item in the one-on-one. What I don't want to do, especially for our high performers or our high achievers on our team, they're going to go into the agenda because they're going to be adding things and preparing for the one-on-one. If they see some really nebulous or not clear agenda item, that's going to give them some anxiety and they're going to wonder like, oh no, am I in trouble? Like, what does Holly want to talk about? So I'll often hide it and then I'll give the feedback in the one-on-one. I'll ask permission to share it. I'll give it and then I'll unhide it as the agenda item. And so that's a really great way to prepare really well, pop it over into the one-on-one, hide it, give it verbally, and then we can unhide it so it's there in the agenda and we can refer back to it. Karissa, I don't know if you wanted to share from your perspective and on the other side of, you know, in the other seat, I guess, of how that works well when you're receiving feedback.
Absolutely. It's so helpful to be able to see that afterwards. And then it helps me either write that feedback recap if I need to go ahead and write that recap, or if you're owning that recap. But I want to hit on another way that we use feedback in our Leadr tool. There's literally a feedback module in there, and you can send out a feedback request and you can add that to your next agenda item, to your next meeting, and be able to really talk about it and unpack that a little bit differently. That way it's not just standing there. We all know that sometimes emotions and tone don't come across in writing. And so when we can do a little bit of both, it's really helpful for accountability.
Yes. And I would love to share a way that I use this personally. You kind of mentioned this earlier, Karissa, like the T3B3 exercise. So essentially it's one, well, I guess it's two questions. I was going to say it's one question. It's two questions, which is what are my top 3 strengths and what are my bottom 3 strengths? And so I like to send this out usually at least once a quarter to someone above me on the org chart, someone that is equal to me on the org chart, and someone that's below me on the org chart. And so this really helps me get that 360 feedback from people that I work with on a day-to-day basis to really understand how they're perceiving my top 3 skills and my bottom 3. Oops, sorry. My slides. And my bottom 3 skills. And so this is Kristen on my team. I sent her my T3B3 request. And it was so helpful. It was so helpful. And so she gave me 3 things that you're seeing here of top 3 and bottom 3. Now, here's the key. This is especially important if you're in a leadership role and you send a request like this out to someone who reports to you. That can be really scary. Like when your boss is asking you for feedback, especially if you have a culture where traditionally it's been scary or unhealthy culture of feedback, it can be intimidating or scary for an employee to raise their voice and give that feedback. So what I try to do is as quickly as I can, I'll forward the email to the person and thank them for the feedback. So in this situation, this was the first time that Kristen had given me feedback through Leadr because she was new to our team. And so I wanted her to hear from me that I was grateful for that so that she can take a deep breath and realize like, okay, my boss just thanked me for that feedback. And now this is a safe place for me to ask for feedback and for me to share feedback. And so I just think that's really critical for us as leaders to lead with gratitude. First of all, we have to model the behavior that we want mirrored. So how can I expect Kristen to ask for feedback if I'm not modeling that behavior and asking for it? So that's number 1. And then number 2, leading with gratitude and thanking my team for their feedback. And I'll often pull out something. So here, like documentation. So I was like, Kristen, thank you so much for taking the time to share this feedback with me. I really take it to heart, and then I'll take something and affirm it. So I agree with what you said about documentation. I move really fast and I'm often not good at documenting. And so thank you for calling that out. I'll be working on some solutions here. So she sees me thanking her and then also closing the loop on feedback that she's given me. So that's something that I try to do from a leadership perspective that I think can help build trust and making sure that we're building psychological safety on the team when it comes to feedback.
Absolutely. And as somebody in that middle manager seat that reports on I think it's important that we change our mindset on feedback as well, and that we view it as an opportunity for coaching. Knowing that you trust me enough, that should be an honor to be able to share some pieces because you want to hear from me. And that is a piece that I like to carry going into those places.
That's awesome.
Awesome. Well, this is not, it shouldn't just end here, right? When we talk about feedback for us at Leadr, this is a beginning and an ending type culture. In fact, I think, Holly, we have a slide in regards to how we use this even in onboarding, right? Like this starts from the very beginning and we have an onboarding opportunity and we have a reviews culture that is memorialization of the conversations that take place. Before I had the opportunity to be promoted, Holly actually sent me this in Leadr. And this is a template we have in the reviews module where Holly asked me some questions, and this is an open review. And so she wanted to hear from me some different things about what it would look like for me to step into a leadership role. This particular question wanted me to answer, how would my peers currently describe me? And what about that description would need to change in order for me to take on more leadership? What was really wonderful about that was I responded, then you read that and you had a response after that. And then we talked about it.
Yes, this was so powerful for so many reasons. So a lot of times we think about reviews, which first of all, I've been in the leadership development space now in different capacities for over 10 years. And I have to say that performance reviews are one of the #1 pain points that I hear from executive leaders. So if you are sitting there thinking, I hate the review process, I hate giving them, I hate receiving them, it is terrible, you are not alone. We here at Leadr are on a mission to change that. But we often think about the review process as isolated to an annual performance review. But what was so helpful about this exercise that you and I did together was this was a leadership review. So we do have biannual performance reviews here at Leadr. We do them in August and we do them in January. But this one was a one-off because I wanted to make sure that we were slowing down enough before you stepped into a leadership role for the first time, that you self-reflected on your own leadership. And then also I was able to give you feedback on that. And so it's critical that we're thinking about reviews outside of just how are you doing in your job over the last 6 months or 3 months or a year, however we do that in our own contexts, but that we're using feedback in a greater context about how to develop you in your own career path. Our 5th foundation is that every employee should have a learning and development plan. And part of your development plan was, how do we get you ready for a leadership role for the first time? And using our reviews module to be able to give you feedback on that for yourself. And then for me to give you feedback on your own feedback was really, really helpful in us preparing you for that role.
Awesome. And it wasn't a surprise.
Yes, that's the key. Feedback is so important because we don't want surprises. That is why we want to make sure we're recapping our feedback conversations. We want to be having regular one-on-ones where we're giving positive and constructive feedback. We want to be having regular reviews because we want to create cultures of no surprises. That's how we build healthy cultures of feedback. You nailed it.
Absolutely. So there's some research to this. We're just not spewing our own thoughts here, that we have some real data. And that research has shown that more than 90% of employees would prefer that their managers address learning opportunities and mistakes in real time, not just during the annual review. Holly, I know I've been a part of an annual review where I had feedback withheld from me that I never knew about. It could be 6 months. And I was like, man, do you know how much better I could have been in these last 6 months if you just would have taken the time to just tell me?
We had, there was a story one of our teammates shared where it was his wife who, I think it was a friend of hers, but anyway, I don't remember who it was, but the point is, yeah, she didn't receive feedback. She received feedback in a performance review that was from 6 months ago. And when we withhold feedback from our team members, we are robbing them of their growth and development because they can't read our minds. And if they were not a part of that feedback conversation and we withhold it from them for a semi-annual or an annual performance review, we are withholding them from their growth and development, which is why it's so important that we give immediate feedback as much as possible. And then the review is just a memorialization of those conversations that we've had on a regular basis. The problem with not having regular one-on-ones and then just having 1 or 2 annual performance reviews is that as the leader, as the manager, we have recency bias. We literally cannot remember, because we're human, what happened 6 months ago, 4 months ago, 3 months ago. I can barely remember what happened yesterday. So when I'm not having regular one-on-ones and giving feedback in those one-on-ones on a consistent basis, the annual or the biannual performance review is useless because we're not able to reflect on those key milestones that happened throughout that time period. And that's why the one-on-ones are so important, so that we are reflecting on those milestones, and then the performance review is just a memorialization of those milestones.
Absolutely. And I think as someone who receives feedback, especially from our executive team, that this is almost the secret sauce to my engagement. It's the reason why it's in the middle of our 5 foundations, is because if I know how to get better, I'm more engaged in what's going on. And when I'm more engaged, I start thinking more like an owner, and I start thinking outside of my role and just what I have going on, and thinking about our organization and the mission that we're trying to accomplish, which is huge, like 1 million leaders that we are on a path to develop. And when I start thinking like that, I honestly start adding more to the bottom line and really help move the organization forward. And I think this is why feedback is so key.
Yeah, it's critical for sure.
Awesome. Well, we've got 1 more stat to 4 more stats.
Like 4, yeah, we have lots of stats.
Them with you. I'm going to go ahead and read them for you. That 94% of executives are confident that employees are satisfied with their company's performance review process. I'm going to guess that statistic of 94% are confident that their employees are satisfied with their reviews process is that's interesting to think through, that they're confident, that they're satisfied with their company's review process. Because the flip side of that, if only 22% of employees feel that the review process is too infrequent. So they're obviously not satisfied at all. And then if we go down to the next one, 61% of employees feel that the review process at their organization is outdated, and 6% of employees feel that the review process is incomplete. That might actually total 94% of dissatisfaction.
That's what's like the key here that is so fascinating, is the gap between how leaders and executives perceive performance reviews going and how they actually are going. I mean, this is alarming, and this is often where we see disengagement happening because the leadership team is not asking for feedback on how their review process is or how their feedback loop is actually working within the organization. So they just assume that it is because they've spent months or years. Sometimes it's amazing to me how many leaders spend months and months and months formalizing these processes, and then they roll them out. And just because of the time investment, they think that they're solid and they're working, but the employees don't feel like they have a voice. They aren't being developed. And so we've really got to make sure we close the feedback loop and make sure that our performance reviews and feedback in general is working effectively within our organizations.
Absolutely. Sometimes when I think about performance reviews that employees love, if I've ever seen that marketed somewhere, I'm like, that's the oxymoron I've ever heard.
Yeah, no, for sure. It really, really is.
Awesome. Well, Holly, there are some incredible questions, and I would love to get into some Q&A.
Let's do it. I'm ready.
First one, something I know you're very passionate about, so I'm going to ask you to give us 60 seconds about this one. Are you ready for it?
Okay, I'm ready.
This one is asking, how can you scale feedback if your team is too large to meet with every individual each week?
Okay, so yes, you do know I'm passionate about this one. You might see my animation come out. Okay, so, and this person's anonymous, so I don't know who it is. So first of all, there is a philosophy. I believe it was the founder of a project management tool, and what he said was that if you can't share a pizza with your direct reports, you have too many. And I'll give it to you. You can have an extra large pizza. Okay, it could be extra large. But the point is that when we say you should be having regular one-on-ones with every person on your team, what we mean is every direct report. So I have a downline. My team just quadrupled, I don't know, from 5 people about a month ago to over 40 plus people in the last few weeks. And so I'm not meeting with every single one of those 40 plus people every single week. Who I am meeting with are my direct reports on at least a weekly basis. Some of them I'll do a bi-weekly one-on-one with, depending on that season and what we're working on together. So that's the first thing that's really important, is make sure that your direct reports you can share a pizza with. The reason for that is because we all only have so much of a span of care. So that's our mission at Leadr, right? Is executing the mission, getting the job done, and the care and development of our people. And we all have different versions of what that looks like. Some of us have a larger span of care. Some of us have a smaller span of care. And so it's critical that we really pay attention to our direct reports and that they're getting the best of us because of our capacity for our span of care. Now, outside of that, that's where we want to have skip levels. So depending on how fast your team moves or projects that you're working on, it might mean that you have a skip level, meaning with people who report to your direct reports, maybe once a month, where you check in on them, or maybe every other week where you're having a one-on-one with them. It really depends on your context and your organization. But first, I just want to make sure that that's really clear, because I do cause confusion a lot, because I'll say every person on your team once a week, and people are like, I have too many. Also, I realize this is way over 60 seconds. I'm almost done. Okay, so then how do you scale feedback? So this is where the power of the feedback tool in Leadr. So for you to be able to send out a feedback request, I did this last week with about 10, I believe it was 10 members of my team. I sent them a specific request that pertained to them and their role. And so that's a really great way for you to use that tool to scale it and ask for that feedback on a regular basis. That's why we've built it into our tool, because it's critical that you scale that healthy culture of feedback. And you get an email when somebody submits it, and that's where I forward that email along and thank them for giving that feedback. Hope that helped. Great question.
Holly, every time you give the pizza illustration, I always think of this instant when my husband and I were on a date night at a pretty fancy Italian restaurant, and these really sweet high school girls get dropped off by their parents. And the table behind us, they're asking the waiter, what is the difference between a large and an extra large pizza? And his response, 2 inches. And he explained that no matter how large the pizza dough is, it's still cut into 8 slices. So 8 plus or minus about 8 direct reports is about what we would suggest is reasonable for you to be able to effectively care for and develop each of your team members.
I have not heard that story yet, Karissa. That is great. I'm stealing that one next time.
You can only imagine Adam and I's humor when we watch these little teeny boppers walk in, and then the waiter's just like, 2 inches.
Yes.
So Holly, there was a part here. Joe had asked, is there a way to use the feedback feature within the one-to-one meeting space in Leadr? And actually, if you could go back to that slide that shows Kristen's feedback to you, I want to point out a button that might be overlooked in our feedback module.
Yeah, definitely. Here, let me share. Here we go. Let's go back. Here we go. Yeah, this little suitcase.
Absolutely. So when that little suitcase is clicked, it adds that feedback, that particular question, that person's answer right into that one-on-one meeting. And so everything is right there. So when we talk about the 5 foundations, and it can feel a little overwhelming, especially if you're not doing any of them, we have found that 4 of those 5 foundations can all be done in the 5th foundation, the one-on-one meeting. So you can give and receive feedback, talk about the clearly documented goals, talk about the personalized learning and development plan and how they're uniquely contributing with their strengths and their gift sets and their skills in regards to moving the mission forward, all in about 45 minutes a week.
No, it's so true. And that has been so helpful to close the feedback loop, to have the feedback attached to the one-on-one. It's been a game changer so that we can actually address it. It's not just hanging out there and the employee is wondering, whatever happened to that feedback that I gave? We're actually closing the loop right there within the one-on-one, which is so powerful.
Absolutely. And then speaking of the one-on-one still in the Leadr module, is there a way to flag something for review?
Yes. So in your one-on-one, you can actually, here, I can share here. Sure. I'm sharing our one-on-one, Karissa. Here we go. So this right here, this little bookmark means that this is bookmarked for Karissa's review. And so this means that when she knows that this is so important to me, that her work-life balance and making sure that I'm doing my best to help her remove any roadblocks there, that we're going to discuss it in our one-on-one or in our performance review. And so it's a recurring agenda item in our one-on-one. We hold space for it every single week. And then it's also bookmarked so that Karissa knows that we're going to be talking about that in her performance review that we're actually doing next week. So
absolutely. And the reason why you asked that is because one of our values here at Leadr is that leaders love Mondays just as much as they love Fridays. So that work-life balance about getting excited to show up every Monday morning and avoiding the Sunday scaries is so important to you that you ask about it every single week.
Yes, you nailed it.
All right, let's go to Brian's question.
Okay.
Holly, you mentioned learning from an exit interview in the past. So should exit interviews be conducted by the manager, someone in HR, both? Is it somebody else? Can you fill us in on your thoughts here?
Yeah, this is a great question, Brian. So in general, my answer would be someone in HR. So you want it to be a safe, objective third party as much as possible. Now, if there is, if you have a really great relationship with the person and in your last one-on-one with them, I would encourage you to ask for feedback. Hey, would love your feedback on as you transition out. You've worked with me for a while. Would love to hear what are my top 3 strengths as a leader that you experience, and what are my bottom 3 strengths that I can work on as I move forward and lead the team. Now, if it's someone who, you've had to terminate or it's a rocky transition, that probably does not make sense. And that should be left with HR. But the final official exit interview should be someone with HR, because you want to make sure that it's documented. You want to make sure that that person should be the safest person for the person to share that feedback with, rather than their direct manager.
Wow. Holly, we've answered all the questions.
Those are great questions.
They were so good. They definitely got us thinking a little bit, as well as how we can even be better. And I know how to expect a feedback request from you.
Exactly.
The reason why we do that is because when feedback is handled with care, it can be the catalyst that helps your team accomplish more than they even thought they were capable of. And that's why Leadr is here, because we want to help make it easy to create thriving and healthy, high-performing teams.
It's so true. So if you're a Leadr customer, hopefully you got some really practical steps for how you can use the Leadr tool, both through the feedback module in your one-on-ones or the performance reviews module, to be able to create a healthy culture of feedback. And if you're not yet a Leadr customer, we would love to officially welcome you to the leaderboard. So you can, you've got my email. If you signed up for this, you have my email address, holly.tate@leadr.com. Just reply to that email and we'll get you set up with a custom demo so we can officially welcome you to the Leadr community.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Holly. And thank you to everybody that joined us. We are humbled that you would choose to spend the last hour of your time with us. We'll see you again for next week's webinar on onboarding.
We'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.